In Lab 7, students are going to learn all about respiration. And a lot of times when students hear the word respiration, they think of breathing. And although oxygen can be involved in some forms of cellular respiration, it's not used in all forms of cellular respiration. So we're going to dig a little deeper to really understand this process of cellular respiration. In order to do that, we need to sort of define our learning outcomes. So we're going to be able to define anaerobic versus aerobic cellular respiration. We want to be able to explain the differences between those different processes. We're going to look at the chemical equation for aerobic cellular respiration. We want students to know that reaction. We want them to know the inputs, the outputs. We want you to know the stages of aerobic cellular respiration. So we'll go over glycolysis, pyruvate, oxidation, citric acid cycle, oxidative phosphorylation a little bit, right? So you can see these are many of the key words that are listed down here. We want to know ultimately how things like temperature affect aerobic cellular respiration. So again, the learning outcomes are almost like a little study guide. By the time you've completed the lab, you've studied the lab, the terms, you've gone over your data, and you've put some real time into it, these are what we hope you can sort of accomplish and you're able to do. All right, so let's start by talking about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is basically a process that all living organisms use in order to generate ATP. Now, organisms that require oxygen to carry out cellular respiration are said to perform aerobic cellular respiration, whereas organisms that don't require oxygen are going to carry out what we refer to as anaerobic cellular respiration. So aerobic cellular respiration requires oxygen to make your ATP. Anaerobic cellular respiration, we're going to make our ATP. You're going to be able to make some ATP or all your ATP, depending on the organism, without oxygen. So anaerobic without, aerobic with. Now, ultimately, ATP is going to be the energy currency of our cell. So ATP is crucial for your cell to survive and maintain homeostasis. It's going to supply basically all the energy required for things like making new molecules or contracting your muscles or transporting nutrients through active transport, removing waste, okay, and a lot of other processes that our cells need to do in order to really survive. So to sustain those processes, in order to carry out all of those cellular processes, the cell has to make substantial amounts of ATP. Now, ultimately, this is the equation that was referenced with the outcomes. So in our cells, and for example, our eukaryotic animal cells, we do this process. We're going to take glucose, which has a lot of potential energy, along with oxygen, and we're going to take the sort of starting pieces of what we need in order to make ATP, and ultimately, we're going to take energy from this in order to attach these phosphates to these ADP, okay? So when we break the bonds that hold glucose together, that potential energy can be released. And ultimately, we're going to use that energy to make ATP. Well, the way that we're going to do that, the way that we're going to break that glucose down is through a series of what are called redox reactions. Redox reactions are those reactions that basically result in some molecules losing electrons while other molecules are going to gain electrons. So, you might remember back to the BIM lab, okay? The term used to describe the loss of electron was oxidation, whereas the term used to describe the gain of electrons was reduction. Now, ultimately, when we look at this, right, for us, glucose is what's going to be oxidized. It's going to lose electrons, just like here, sodium loses the electrons. So in aerobic cellular respiration, that starting reactant of glucose will be oxidized. Well, if something's oxidized, something's going to have to be reduced. So, flipped ahead. So the question is, well, what's going to accept the those electrons? And the answer is oxygen. For you and I, as we oxidize glucose and we break the bonds and we ultimately release that energy, those electrons are going to be transferred to oxygen, and ultimately we're going to form water in that redox reaction. So again, just to kind of bring this back around, right? Glucose is going to be oxidized. It's our source of energy, and that's tied up in the electrons and the bonds that glucose has. So as we oxidize glucose, we're going to reduce oxygen. In other words, oxygen is going to accept the electrons. Glucose donates them, oxygen accepts them, and in the process, we're going to ultimately make the end product water. So again, a lot of information here goes along with information in your textbook in chapter 6. So I would very much encourage you to look and read through that chapter if you haven't, as well as read through all of the information and background information that we give you in the lab book. Now, the different chemical reactions that we're going to do. So we're going to start with glycolysis, then we're going to do citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. Ultimately, as I mentioned already, in the first thing that we're going to have to do in glycolysis is we're going to have to take that glucose molecule and we're going to have to oxidize it. Now, as we take glucose and we oxidize it, as we break it down through a number of different metabolic reactions, so it takes us a while to break glucose down, we are going to transfer those high energy electrons from glucose to something called NAD+. NAD+ is basically an electron carrier. It's a molecule that can accept high energy electrons and hydrogen ions. And as that NAD+ accepts those electrons along with the hydrogen ions, it's going to be reduced to this thing called NADH. And NADH is going to be this cool little transporter that's going to drive those high energy electrons to the inner membrane of the mitochondria, where we're going to make most of our ATP. So again, if we're talking about, let's just pretend that this is glucose, C6H12O6. As we oxidize glucose, we're pulling away those high energy electrons, we're pulling away hydrogen ions from that glucose. Well, ultimately, as we oxidize glucose, something else is going to be reduced. So this little NAD+ here, it's a very important little enzyme. It will readily accept those electrons and hydrogen ions and become NADH. Ultimately, as we oxidize glucose through these first stages here, all of that little NADH that's going to be made is going to be ultimately used in that last step of oxidative phosphorylation. So again, just to kind of go back over this, right? We are going to take glucose and we're going to break it down into using really three different stages ultimately to make ATP. We're going to do the stages of glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation / citric acid cycle. Okay, these are two different processes. And finally, we're going to finish with oxidative phosphorylation. So with this process of oxidizing glucose, right? And we're going to start oxidizing glucose out here in the process, through the process of glycolysis, out in the cytosol, out in the cytoplasm, outside of the mitochondria. But as we break it down and we form pyruvate, this process moves into the mitochondria, where the last parts of and again, we're going to kind of talk here about aerobic cellular respiration, where pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation, those remaining stages are going to happen here in the mitochondria. Ultimately, okay, and I'm going to finish this video and make another video where we talk a little bit more about these steps and then get into what you're going to do in lab. Ultimately, it's important that students understand that it's these stages that have to happen during aerobic cellular respiration in order for us ultimately to generate large enough quantities of ATP to stay alive. And really, what these are is a series of redox reactions, starting with stage 1 glycolysis that happens in the cytoplasm where we oxidize glucose, and ultimately finishing with this process called oxidative phosphorylation, where we can generate a whole lot of ATP with a lot of those little NADH that we're generating along the way.